Hello, I already made a video about corruption once. Many of you watched it, some of you found the channel through it, and some of you still remember specific lines from it. That video spread quickly, and then it disappeared because of copyright issues. At the time I felt finished. I thought I had said what needed to be said. Looking back now, I understand that I described the surface accurately, but I didn't yet understand the structure I was describing from the inside. When people hear the word corruption, they usually think of money. Envelopes, bribes, stolen budgets, officials living beyond their salaries. That image is convenient, because it frames corruption as a moral defect, a flaw in character, a problem of bad individuals inside an otherwise normal system. And if that were true, the solution would be simple: punish the bad people, clean the system, restore order. But corruption survives for decades, not because people are immoral, and not because enforcement is weak. It survives because it quietly replaces something much more important than money. It replaces the relationship between a person and reality. Growing up in Russia, corruption was not something you entered into consciously. You didn't decide one day to participate in it. You were already inside it before you had words for it. Nobody taught it to you explicitly. There were no lectures, no explanations. You learned it the way you learn gravity, by falling enough times to understand what pulls you down. Very early on, you understand that official explanations don't explain outcomes, forms do not produce results, rules do not guarantee anything. Instructions describe an ideal world that nobody actually lives in. What determines outcomes is something else entirely: access, timing, mood, personal leverage, and how inconvenient you are willing to be. This realization doesn't come as a shock. It comes quietly through repetition. You see that the same rule produces different results for different people. You see that silence sometimes works better than argument. You notice that confidence matters way more than correctness. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, you stop trusting written reality. This is the first deep effect of corruption. It teaches you that the surface of things is fake, completely fake. Once you internalize that, your attention shifts. You stop reading signs and start reading people. You don't ask, what does the rule say? You ask, who is sitting on the other side of the desk today? Are they tired? Are they irritated? Are they bored? Are they rushed? Are they important or pretending to be important? You learn to calibrate your behavior not to standards, but to personalities, to people. This is why Russians often appear socially sharp, intuitive, even manipulative sometimes. When systems don't function impersonally, survival depends on reading informal signals with precision. Tone becomes information, pauses become information, facial expressions become information. What is not said matters way more than what is said. Corruption trains this skill relentlessly. At the same time, something else disappears: the idea of a neutral process. In functional societies, procedures are boring, but they are real. You don't need to negotiate with them. You don't need to fear them. They may be slow, imperfect, frustrating, but they're predictable. In Russia, predictability does not come from systems. It comes from relationships. This has enormous consequences for how people think about fairness. Fairness is not an abstract moral value. It is a lived experience. You believe in fairness if you have seen the same rule applied to different people in the same way. If you haven't, fairness sounds like ideology, not reality. That's why discussions about justice often feel hollow, not offensive, just detached. When outcomes are obviously negotiable, talking about equality feels naive, just naive. People don't reject fairness out of cynicism. They reject it because it doesn't match experience. What replaces fairness is something colder and more practical: adaptability. In a corrupt system, the competent person is not the honest one. The competent person is the one who knows how things actually work, the one who understands informal hierarchies, the one who can bypass friction, the one who doesn't get stuck arguing with signs on doors. This creates a strange moral inversion. Principle becomes weakness. The highest compliment is not good or honest, but understands life. And that phrase, understands life, is doing a lot of work. It means you know when rules matter and when they don't. You know who to approach and who to avoid. You know how to make things happen quietly. You know that complaining is rarely productive and that subtle pressure is more effective than open resistance. This mindset produces people who are extremely capable in broken environments. Russians are often very good at navigating chaos, uncertainty, and informal systems. They improvise well and they adapt faster than most. But there is a cost that is much harder to see. Corruption slowly destroys long-term thinking. Planning far ahead only makes sense if the rules governing your future are stable, if credentials matter, if institutions remember you consistently. When none of that is guaranteed, long-term plans feel fragile, almost foolish. Why invest emotionally in a career path if one arbitrary decision can erase it? Why believe in merit if advancement depends on proximity? Why trust education if it doesn't protect you? Why plan 10 years ahead if tomorrow's reality can invalidate today's effort? So people plan short, not because they lack ambition, but because ambition without stability feels like self-deception. The future becomes something abstract and suspicious. Talking about it feels like tempting fate. Over years, this shapes personality. You become alert, reactive, flexible, and exhausted. Another effect that's less obvious is how responsibility dissolves. In functional systems, responsibility is visible. Decisions have authors, mistakes can be traced, accountability exists because cause and effect are legible. Even when people lie, the structure itself insists on clarity. In a corrupt system, clarity is too dangerous. Nobody wants to be the final decision maker. Nobody wants their name attached to an outcome. So decisions are fragmented, authority is diffused, instructions are vague, answers are indirect. Instead of yes or no, you get we'll see, come back later, it depends, this is not my department, there are complications. If something works, it worked somehow. If it fails, it failed objectively. This ambiguity protects everyone involved. It also ensures that punishment is never automatic. It becomes selective, negotiable, contextual. And once punishment is selective, loyalty becomes more valuable than competence. Safety becomes more important than truth. Predictability disappears. People stop optimizing for quality and start optimizing for invisibility. They learn not to stand out, not to challenge, not to attract attention unless it's controlled. This is how corruption reproduces itself without coordination. There is no mastermind, no ideology, no central conspiracy. Just millions of small decisions made under uncertainty, all pointing in the same direction. People often ask why corruption feels so resistant to reform. The answer is that corruption creates stability in unstable environments. It's inefficient economically, but efficient psychologically. It gives people a sense of control when formal systems don't. From the inside, corruption does not feel like theft. It feels like it's the only way to keep moving. It doesn't generate constant outrage because nobody forces you. You choose to, because refusing is costly. Resistance requires time, emotional energy, and tolerance for humiliation. Cooperation is way faster and much easier. Over time, this erodes something fundamental: expectation. People stop expecting institutions to work, and once expectation disappears, betrayal becomes impossible. You can't feel cheated by something you never trusted. Corruption also reshapes how people relate to the state itself. The state stops being something you belong to. It becomes something external, almost foreign. You navigate it like terrain. You don't identify with it, you don't protect it, you don't improve it. Civic responsibility collapses not because people are selfish, but because ownership was never granted. Why care about something that never responds to you? Why defend a structure that treats you as a material, not participant? This is why Russian society often looks paradoxical from the outside. People can be extremely generous and supportive in personal relationships, while showing complete indifference toward abstract institutions. Family and close networks matter intensely. Anything larger feels unreal. When I left Russia, this mental structure didn't disappear overnight. I carried it with me. I trusted people more than procedures, even when procedures were clearly safer. I kept waiting for hidden letters, unofficial expectations, sudden reversals. When something worked smoothly, I felt a bit uneasy. When nobody demanded extra proof or favors, it felt like a setup. It took time to accept that some systems don't need to be negotiated, they just function. That realization was painful, because it meant that what I had learned to call life experience was actually survival training for a broken environment. Corruption doesn't just exist because systems are broken. Over time, systems remain broken because corruption allows people to live inside that brokenness without confronting it directly. It absorbs pressure, it prevents collapse, and it prevents change. A society can survive dysfunction indefinitely if people learn how to adapt to it, but survival is not development. This is why everything stays half-functional, not enough to fall apart, not enough to improve, just enough to continue extracting effort from people without giving them leverage in return. When people ask why Russians don't demand change, they misunderstand what demanding requires. Demanding assumes that demands matter. Corruption teaches you very effectively that they don't. This isn't an excuse, it's not a justification, it's rather a description of an environment formed over decades. There is another layer to this that I didn't understand until much later, and it's harder to describe because it sits inside you quietly. Corruption doesn't just teach you how to act, it teaches you how to feel about your own actions. It slowly changes your internal sense of legitimacy. In a system where rules are negotiable, doing things the right way stops feeling virtuous and starts feeling impractical. You don't feel proud for following procedures, you feel exposed. You feel like you are voluntarily making your own life harder for no reason. Over time, this erodes the emotional reward of honesty. Honesty doesn't disappear, but it detaches from outcomes. You can be honest and still lose. You can be dishonest and still sleep very well. The link between behavior and consequence weakens. This is deeply destabilizing, because humans rely on feedback loops to orient themselves morally. When those loops are broken, people don't become evil, they become situational. Ethics become contextual, flexible, and adaptive. What matters is not whether something is right, but whether it is safe. And safety becomes the dominant value. You start measuring actions by risk exposure. Will this attract attention? Will this annoy someone with power? These questions replace moral ones because it is no longer protective. This creates a very specific kind of internal split. Publicly, people repeat the language of rules, law, fairness, and so on. Privately, they operate by a completely different logic. Everyone knows the gap exists, but nobody treats it as hypocrisy. It's just realism. Living with this split for years produces a subtle emotional numbness. You stop reacting strongly to contradictions. You learn not to expect coherence between words and reality. When officials say one thing and do another, it doesn't really feel wrong. It feels normal. This is why outrage fatigue sets in so early. Scandals don't shock, they confirm. Exposure doesn't change behavior, it just reinforces cynicism. When corruption is systemic, revelation loses its power. Another effect that took me a long time to articulate is how corruption reshapes self-image. In a functional system, your identity is partially anchored in roles: student, professional, citizen, contributor. Those roles imply reciprocal obligations. You do your part, the system does its part. In a corrupt system, roles are hollow. Titles exist, but they don't protect you. Credentials exist, but they don't guarantee anything. Identity becomes less about what you are and more about what you can manage. So people start identifying with their coping strategies. I am someone who can figure things out. I know how to survive. I know how to talk to people. These sound like strengths, and in many ways they are, but they also indicate something missing. Trust in structures outside yourself. When you don't trust systems, you internalize responsibility for everything. Success is yours because you navigated correctly. Failure is also yours because you didn't. Structural factors fade into the background. This creates a heavy psychological load. You're always on alert, always adjusting, always scanning for danger. This constant vigilance is exhausting, even when you don't consciously notice it. It also creates a strange relationship with power. Power is not seen as something abstract or institutional. It's personal, moody, unpredictable. You don't respect power, you manage it. You don't challenge it, you work around it. This is why people can appear passive in public and fiercely resourceful in private. Private spaces feel alive because rules are clearer. Over time, this trains people to keep their real selves small and hidden. You don't express too much. You don't commit fully. You don't reveal long-term intentions. You maintain optionality. Flexibility becomes a form of armor. When you leave that environment, this armor doesn't disappear immediately. It follows you. I noticed it in myself abroad. I hesitated to trust contracts, even when they were enforceable. I preferred verbal reassurance to written guarantees, even when written guarantees were way stronger, obviously. I felt uneasy relying on institutions instead of people. In moments where I could simply follow a procedure, I still looked for the real channel behind it. I assumed there must be one. That assumption took time to dismantle. Another realization came even later. Corruption doesn't just affect how you interact with the state, it affects how you imagine collective action. Collective action requires trust, not just in people, but in systems that coordinate effort fairly. When you believe that outcomes are pre-negotiated, participation feels pointless. Voting feels symbolic, complaints feel performative, engagement feels like theater. So people disengage emotionally, even if they remain physically present. They go through motions without belief, they comply without investment. This creates a society that looks stable but feels hollow. Another thing corruption does is distort how success is perceived. In environments where outcomes are negotiable, visible success is ambiguous. You don't know whether someone succeeded because of competence, connections, luck, or protection. This ambiguity breeds suspicion. Admiration becomes conditional. Envy becomes quieter, but way sharper. People stop celebrating achievement openly because it attracts questions. Success is safer when it's understated. Failure too becomes ambiguous. Was it deserved? Was it engineered? Responsibility dissolves again. This ambiguity poisons feedback. Without clear signals, improvement becomes difficult. You don't know what to emulate or what to avoid. You only know what didn't get punished this time. Over decades, this produces stagnation without collapse, movement without progress, activity without direction. And yet, and this is important, people still live. They laugh, joke, build friendships, raise families. Corruption doesn't raise humanity, it compresses it, it pushes it inward. This is why Russian private life can feel incredibly rich and emotionally intense, while public life feels empty and cynical. Meaning retreats from shared spaces and concentrates in personal ones. Living that environment creates a strange sense of loss. Even when things improve materially, something familiar disappears. The constant alertness, the shared understanding, the dark humor, the unspoken rules. At the same time, something else emerges. Quiet relief. The relief of not needing to read every interaction for danger, the relief of trusting procedures, the relief of planning without fear that the ground will shift tomorrow. That relief doesn't come immediately. At first, predictability feels boring, almost suspicious. You're used to tension, you're used to improvisation. Stability feels like emptiness. Only later do you realize how much energy improvisation consumed. This is the cost that's hardest to quantify. Corruption drains attention. It forces people to spend cognitive and emotional resources navigating friction that shouldn't exist. It taxes every interaction. Over a lifetime, that tax is gigantic. And this leads to the final insight, the one that reframes everything. Corruption is not just a failure of morality or governance, it is a failure of trust accumulation. Functional societies accumulate trust over time. Broken ones consume it faster than it can regenerate. Once trust drops below a certain threshold, informal mechanisms take over. They work locally, temporarily, and inefficiently, but they work enough to prevent collapse. That's why corruption is so persistent. Removing corruption without rebuilding trust just doesn't work. You just remove the coping mechanism and leave the wound open. This is why sudden anti-corruption efforts often backfire. They remove informal stability without providing formal reliability. People don't feel liberated, they feel exposed. Understanding this doesn't make corruption acceptable. Of course no, but it does make it comprehensible. The first video showed what corruption looks like in daily life. This extended version is about what it does over time. To attention, to emotion, to identity, to imagination. Corruption doesn't need fear to survive. It doesn't need violence or belief. It only needs people to slowly accept that this is how reality functions and to adapt accordingly. That acceptance is not stupidity, it's endurance. And once you see the corruption that way, you stop asking why people tolerate it. You start asking how much invisible effort it takes to live inside it every day. This is not analysis meant to convince. It's just me describing the psychological environment I grew up in, and only fully understood once I had enough distance to see its shape. That's all. Thank you for watching.